Hello, John and Anne. Such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed for JCACS. I wanted to tell our listeners the first time I came across you personally. Obviously, I came across your work before I met you in person. As a PhD student, I read a lot about your ideas of making mathematics more accessible. This is my interpretation of your work, but if you have, you're more than welcome to say how else you see your work. And when I got the privilege of meeting you in person in Germany at the ICME conference in Hamburg at the time, I don't know how it happened that you invited a group of us PhD students to join you for lunch. That was a turning point for me because the manner and the invitation caught me really unprepared, because I never thought that renowned people like yourself will be, inviting PhD students to sit with you. So thank you so much. That was absolutely a positive experience. I have a few questions that I would like to ask you. Your collective work is grounded in mathematics education, right? Everybody who knows about John Mason and Ann Watson know that it is grounded in math education. Can you talk about the objective of your research and some of the principles or tenets that guide your work and scholarship?
Go ahead.
I think we have slightly different directions which then overlap. So my direction comes from having been a teacher for quite a long time and training teachers. And so it's about thinking about the mathematics in the teaching and learning that goes on in classrooms, and wanting to understand and help towards teachers being able to consider the conceptual development of learners and learning. And that involves analyzing the concepts for yourself and really continually improving your own knowledge of understanding the mathematical concepts and how they run throughout school mathematics. So that's the work the teacher has to do, but then turning that into tasks which enable learners to appreciate and encounter those concepts in a continual way throughout the curriculum, throughout their school experience. And by doing that, you have to draw on
students' natural powers. I was thinking back. I was inspired. My father had studied a book called is by Sylvanus P. Thompson, and in the introduction, I've forgotten the title, but in the introduction he says, "What one fool can do, another can." And that really that has been behind everything that I think about. So I observed that I managed to do reasonably well in mathematics, and I was using various powers. And George Polya gave me an articulation of some of those powers, which Caleb Gattegno also thinks about or thought about, but in slightly different language. And so my line has always been that virtually everybody can think mathematically. The issue is, how can we help people recognize the fact that they can think mathematically and develop those powers, and they're natural powers which we all use anyway, but to use them in a particularly mathematical way.
And one of the sad things that's happening now in some countries, certainly in our country and in America and possibly in Canada as well, is that the understanding of the mind that is coming from cognitive science, deals with memory and the black box of memory and cognitive load as starting from the point of what the human mind cannot do, and therefore kind of has to be told or learnt, wrote, or something like that, rather than starting from the place of what the human mind can do, which is learn from examples and generalize and try things out and accumulate complex concepts.
And so for me, that's developed into the structure of attention, because it seems to me that attention is at the heart of every educational experience. What am I attending to? And not just what, but how? And am I attending in the same way that my teacher is, and to the same thing that my teacher is? And in one of my lines now would be that that the teacher's job is to detect where the student is attending and how they're attending, and then offer some tasks which bring about a shift of that attention into a more helpful place.
So our individual work deals with that issue in a couple of different but related ways. One of them, this is John's speciality, is helping people learn from their own experience. And I do that as well, but I also try to work with teachers on understanding the conceptual pathway that goes with the development of mathematical ideas, so that they're more articulate about what the mathematical concepts are that you hope that learners will then experience and learn from. But teachers also learn from experience, but it has to be a kind of aware experience. And that's where our writings and so on come in, that we try to articulate what perhaps has been tacit or not articulated about those processes.
So one of my many slogans is one thing that we don't seem to learn from experience is that we don't often learn from experience alone. I don't mean alone as individuals, although that's also maybe the case, but there's something more is required than simply having an experience. And that's where pedagogy really plays a big role.
Absolutely, and I hope we'll have time to talk about the how we translate those ideas to strategies, to teaching strategies that people can use. And I'm saying people because that includes parents, it includes teachers, because reading through your work, I know that you have talked about these experiences that people also, students bring from their homes, right? And so these experiences need to be discussed and perhaps surfaced in terms of what kind of mathematics people already bring with them, and the power of noticing. I know you did not use the word noticing, but attention and the ability to detect what students do, not for the purpose of judging and saying, okay, he or she or they know it, and so I can move on to the next point. But what I like about how you said it, Anne, is the pathway, the conceptual pathway, to see math education as a conceptual pathway rather than a linear, order or structure of concepts that need to be covered or mastered at any given time. So
that's the contrast between the staircase model of learning, where you master a step and then you're allowed to make the next step, and then you master that and you make the next step, and a maturational view of learning, where you very much in line with Bruner and Dewey, where you encounter the same things over and over, but in a more sophisticated way. Indeed, T.S. Eliot, and we return to the same place, but we know it for the first time.
I like the how you tie in with learning theories, because that's what math educators, I think, I believe, try to do, rather than um, prescribing specific ways of teaching. This is how you teach fractions, this is how you teach multiplication, or this is what multiplication structures mean. It is more about how we can translate learning theories such as Dewey, such as Vygotsky, such as any or mathematicians, right? How did mathematicians experience the learning of mathematics, so that we can learn from that and perhaps replicate, you know, a learning experience that is that supports or fosters a can-do mindset of learning mathematics. So what I'm hearing is also some reference to neuroscience, and how this can be harnessed to our better understanding of what works and what doesn't work and why it doesn't work. So, for example, if in the past teachers were encouraged, or perhaps unintentionally prohibiting or not allowing students to use their fingers, or what I call embodied mathematics, now we have neuroscience research that shows if you use embodied math, counting with, using your fingers when you count, or making sense of a mathematical conception by moving around, amazing work that shows that the retention or long-term memory is allowed because people are using their bodies to make sense of mathematical concepts. But going back to the notion of noticing, how can teachers notice these without how can teachers notice these and surface these abilities in so that, as you said, John, they can detect the learning and move on to, to build on natural powers that learners bring with them?
Well, at the heart of this, it seems to me, is the fact, I think it's a fact, that the only person who can do the learning is the learner. I cannot do the learning. All I can do is set up situations where they have an encounter, an experience, which they then construe, make sense of, which brings them in contact with mathematical structure, mathematical thinking, mathematical powers.
But to be aware of that as a teacher, if your model of teaching mathematics is about facts and procedures and solving word problems on a Friday using the technique that you've done all week, then you're miles away from it. So you have to first of all help the teacher to become aware of what they're doing. I mean, one of the things I love is the using of the hands. There's certain sorts of counting when you're counting the fence posts, and when you're counting the fencing between them. You know, there's 4 lengths of fencing here, but there's 5 posts. If you're thinking in terms of your age and the number of birthdays you've had, nearly all of us reach for our fingers in order to say, well, in 1949, I was 1, and to start from there. And we use our fingers as tallies. It's absolutely natural. One of the things that I've loved looking at recently is the work of Jerry Lipker, who worked for 20 years, 30 years maybe, with the Yupik nation, and finding that their natural ways of knowing are all embodied. They're about symmetry, and particularly this 2-way symmetry, and building a European heritage kind of maths curriculum on the fundamental ways of knowing that the Yupik nation had in their language and in the way that they talked about the world. And it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. And you read it and you think, well, hang on a minute. This is like what Montessori was doing. This is like what Davidoff was talking about. this is what early years specialists talk about. It's there. It's not that we didn't know this. It's that somehow in school mathematics we've gone for the final moments where you say, oh, we call this multiplication, or oh, we call this a pentagon, without all the building up that leads you to know what it is that's being named. And you earlier mentioned multiplication, and that's a prime example of something which conceptually you have to return to again and again and again and again, and your understanding of what multiplication is complexifies the further you go in mathematics. There's never a moment for a definition, a final definition that pins it down like that. There's just a whole bunch of experiences, and you need to make sure that learners have those experiences. And when you've done that, to get them to talk about it, to exemplify it, to talk to you about it, to talk to each other about it, and to keep on with that process throughout the school curriculum.
I love it. Yeah.
That brings up something I wanted to say earlier, which is another slogan, but this one is from Brent Davis, which is teaching by listening. You were asking about how you notice, how you become aware of what students are attending to and might be useful that they could attend to, and it's through listening and watching. That is how that's done. But I also wanted to add that I'm very keen on everything that Anna has been saying and the Enactivist program. But I want to add to that there's a weaning. If you want to go into advanced mathematics, you need to wean yourself off the counting on your fingers. Anne had experiences with people coming into high school who were still weren't even counting on. They were counting all on their fingers when they were supposed to be adding a couple of quite small numbers. Well, that's really going to completely hold you back if you haven't gained the facility of developing the Brunner spiral, or however you want to describe it, where you're making use of your powers and you don't need to always backtrack down to the physical. The inactive becomes inactive with things you're confident about, but you're confident with things that are more abstract than they were than previously. So the abstract becomes, and the symbolic becomes inactive. And I think that's really important.
It is. So but there are some things which it's really, really useful to know in the way that the cognitive load people would like us to know. It's quite nice when you see the number 48 to think of all the possibilities it offers to you, all the multiplicative possibilities it offers to you. If you don't have that sense that 48 offers you lots of possibilities, 49 offers you quite an interesting possibility, but only one, and 47 is, oh, well, that's this special thing that we call a prime. If you don't have that, you are hampered. So there are some stages where there needs to be some knowledge which is part of the shared canon of mathematics, and particularly the shared canon of arithmetic. But there are far fewer of these than some of the policymakers would tell us that you have to have. It's learning facts is not the major part of learning mathematics by any means.
I had a class earlier today where the teacher candidate said, math is all about making sure students know the facts. And so we had a whole conversation about, actually, no, math is not knowing facts. It is understanding how concepts are related to each other, understanding concepts and how they are related to each other. So I like the metaphor of a staircase and the immersion into deeper and deeper layers of what it means to work with multiplication structures. Another misperception is that multiplication is repeated addition, which is something that we need to unlearn, because teacher candidates 2 weeks before they finish their program and again, we have loads and loads of research that shows talks about misperceptions that need to be surfaced. I love the fact the question was about tenets, and you suggested that it is mathematics needs to be talked in terms of possibilities rather than products or ticking off achievements. Possibilities in and between mathematical concepts. And if we don't use possibilities, then learning is hampered. And that's very deep because it makes me think of the work of Paul Erdős, who was all about making sense of mathematical concepts, particularly number sense, number theory. But as I was reading about him and his work, I was astounded by the realization that math is a combination of some level, as John said, automatization. We want our students to be, to be able to work with concepts without using their fingers, or, at later stage. But it is also so that's a goal in itself, but also making connections all the time and going deeper and deeper as we go along. So I would like to go to the next question. In light of your continual work and its different focal points, what might be some of the changes you would like to see in mathematics curricula? And I know that may be a question that, you don't have a ready-made response to, but I think that your work, your thinking about teachers noticing and possibilities, math as possibilities rather than objectives that need to be mastered within a certain time frame. How would you like in a perfect world to see school curriculum in math?
I've got a very general response to that. Policymakers appear to me to be frightened that things aren't going to happen. And so the only way to make things happen is to control what people do, to tell them what to do, to make sure they do the right thing. And that lack of trust, that lack of appreciation. I mean, we're in the midst of becoming much more aware of the environment, of how nature works. And yet the organic metaphor, the notion that human beings are organisms with all these powers to make sense of things. So why not put people into situations where they can make sense? You can certainly guide the sense making to some extent, but it's the sense making which matters. And so my desire would be to stop trying to control what teachers do, what heads of school, what headmasters, principals, whatever, what they do. Stop trying to control what teachers do. Stop trying to control what students do, and rather create the garden of mathematics where people can grow and flourish.
I had a brief experience with a curriculum that I really enjoyed and my colleagues really enjoyed using, which was that we had themes of work. So we would have perhaps 5 weeks with a theme entitled growth. And within that, we would be looking at some graphical stuff, some sequences, enlargements, a whole range of things that involved growth, exponential growth, all kinds of things, some realistic situations, some more abstract mathematical situations, lots and lots of use of computer graph plotters and so on, and that all those ideas could live together in the work of the students. And then another 5 or 6 weeks would be spent on something like, gosh, it's only growth I can remember now because it's so long ago, but those sorts of ideas anyway, within which you can experience a whole range of mathematics that is related conceptually. And that was great, but it didn't last very long because we got high stakes testing, and people had to know certain things by a certain date, that kind of thing. But it's a mishmash here, a mix up between curricula and assessment regimes, and the control of pedagogy and the control of schemes of work, that kind of thing. A mathematics curriculum ought to be about developing the conceptual threads, about the development of mathematical thinking, about procedures, relating procedures to the making of sense in mathematics. That's what a curriculum ought to have in it. And in particular, a maths curriculum ought to have quite a big acquaintance with computational thinking, because that's the world that we're educating people into. And as PISA says, the results of the 2012 PISA maths questions showed that the thing that people found most difficult was formulating something mathematically so that they could then work on it. Well, what's the point of doing the maths if you learning the maths if you can't then look at a situation and formulate it so you can use the maths that you've learned in order to work on the situation? So the solving of unfamiliar problems that you've never met before, for instance, and I'm not using the word problem here to mean word problems, but the solving of unfamiliar problems, the working with unfamiliar problems, the exploration of unfamiliar mathematical environments has to be in the curriculum. Otherwise, it just won't happen. And what we're getting in the countries where I've worked with the curriculum is we're getting this idea that you have to kind of learn everything, and then if you're really good and if you carry on and if you're still in the game when you're 16, 17, 18, then you can begin to solve unfamiliar problems. That's far too late. But you look at children in kindergarten and they're solving unfamiliar problems using what they know and what their experiences are, and experimenting. If they are encouraged by the teacher to have a go at something, they will have a go at it. And that sort of, that gap between early years and studying advanced levels of school maths loses us so many people. And I'm not at all surprised that some of the people who in the past would have become really hot mathematicians now choose computer science, because that's where they can tackle something that gives them brain ache, but which they can keep going back to work on again and again and again, and test things out and so on. That's where they can do that.
Do we, yeah, John?
In 2 days' time, I'm due to give a session to a conference of teachers. And the main theme of the conference is owning the curriculum. And my session is called Who Owns the Curriculum? And my claim is that the whole point is that the students, the learners, own the curriculum, because it isn't a curriculum until they own it. It belongs to the policymakers. It belongs to the administrators. It belongs to the teacher. I mean, most people want the teacher to own the curriculum. I want the learners to own the curriculum. In
the perfect world, correre means to run. How
exactly.
much of the running with students do we have, or do we allow students to do? Working as a teacher educator, working with teachers, I see teachers as change agents. So students will not be able to own the curriculum if the conditions are not set, the necessary conditions are not set by the teachers to allow students to own the curriculum. So I really believe that it is in the hands of the teachers who are, going into their classroom, closing the door, and having this golden opportunity to shape next generations of mathematicians. And as you said, everyone can do it. It's just noticing what they do. I know I'm saying just, but it's not as simple as it sounds, but it is noticing what they already know and build. And as Anne said, build on what you can already do and then go from there. That's so inspiring.
Like what art teachers do, or what people teaching poetry do. That's how they teach. And it wouldn't make sense to teach any other way other than to see what the children are doing with the initial stimulus that you've given them, and then to help them shape that and develop that and bring it to fruition.
So one of my questions to head teachers has been, would you hire a music teacher who didn't themselves music in some way? Would you hire an art teacher who didn't in some way art? And yet you'll hire a mathematics teacher who barely knows, where the textbook is and what's in the textbook.
That's a bit rude.
You want somebody, you want a mathematics teacher who
feels confident in doing mathematics, perhaps, and is not afraid to recognize themselves as learners of math as well. I think one of the problems is that they position, it's not us and them, it's the reality of many math teachers who are, and again, it's substantiated in research out there, empirical research, that feel afraid of math themselves, and so they keep themselves very close to what the book dictates them to do and how to do it. And so that's one of the things we need to change, I think, in curriculum. And what I hear when we think about mathematics, I think an action point following this interview, I hope, would be to allow graduate students and teacher educators to think about how else can we teach math, not in terms of mathematical concepts. I shouldn't say concept, but procedures, not very much procedures, but really themes, as Anne suggested. Growth. How can we understand growth and harness mathematical concepts to understand growth, the concept of growth better? Offer ill-structured problems and work with the students on making sense of these problems. So I would like to move on to the next question that I have. Thinking about your experience with curriculum in mathematics education, can you talk about changes in math curricula in your context? Obviously, we have change, and change happens with the help of teachers. I mean, teachers many times in other disciplines or in educational change in general propagate or start this change top down, bottom up. Any experiences with change in math education that you experienced?
This is really hard to answer because we don't know anything about changes in mathematics curricula elsewhere, and we know a little bit here, but we don't know about what happens in classrooms that much. But I was involved in the changes in the maths curriculum in England and also the changes in the maths curriculum in Wales. And you couldn't get two more different processes. In England, it was top down, not from maths education experts, not even from mathematicians, but from politicians who wanted a knowledge-based curriculum that they recognized from their childhood and that followed the writings of Ed Hirsch. And their idea of knowledge was facts and procedures. And as far as they were concerned, you didn't have to, if you were just teaching facts, it didn't matter how young the child was, you could still teach them facts because they could still repeat facts. And so that we've ended up with a very difficult curriculum developmentally. In Wales, it was completely the other way around. It was, let's have a new curriculum, let's get bunches of teachers together from all over the country, which is 4 million people or something, from all over the country, and let them develop the curriculum. Totally different. Now, of course, the teachers in Wales started from what they knew, but were very open-minded when they talked to each other. You'd have teachers from all phases, from early years right up to the end of school, in the same room, talking about the same core concepts, the same concept groups, if you like, in mathematics. And they were learning from each other, and they were playing with different orders of things and different kind of developmental pathways. You couldn't get to more different things. But what I think is more important is, what is the pedagogy then like? And that's what politicians are unable to legislate for. They're trying hard, but they can't, because once the teacher is in the classroom interacting with the learners, then the interaction comes from that teacher and those children in that lesson at that moment in time with the particular stimulus. And that's where the enacted and experienced curriculum happens.
An example has come to mind. I hadn't thought of it before in these terms, but at the Open University in the 1980s, when we started to try and support teachers directly, teachers of mathematics more directly than simply offering mathematics courses, one of the things we did is we went into classrooms and filmed before we decided what it was we were going to film. Someone would spend a week or two in the classroom, and then the cameras would come in, and then we used that together with the available research, which was largely based on Brunner and Dewey, to make sense of what we were seeing. Now, that seems to me to be an interesting version of an math education curriculum, because very often I think it might be the other way around. Here are the theories, now go out into the classroom and do thou likewise.
What I hear with what happens in many countries is that policymakers, that they and again, with all good intentions, right? I mean, they want students to succeed, and they believe, not that I check that, but I believe that they believe that reproducing the ways they learned math, they did it well, so it worked. But I keep saying to myself, it worked in spite of how things are done, not because of how things are done. It's in spite of all the educational teachings and pedagogies that do not really reflect what research already knows about things that work and that don't work. And using Dewey and Brunner, I think what the key theme that I get from their work is democratizing and bringing the democratization into math education may be something that kind of be perhaps understood as incompatible, but it is about democratizing math and mathematics teaching. And I agree with you, to bring change, it needs to be an ongoing process. You can't dictate it. It has to be an ongoing process. Meaningful change, that is long lasting, needs to have adequate support. And support doesn't necessarily come from, this is how you do it, but what sense making takes place with others who are going through the same process of making teaching more effective by noticing.
That brings me right back to one thing we don't seem to learn from experience, is that we don't learn from experience alone, but we need the organic metaphor, the maturational metaphor, making bread, making beer, making wine, that sort of thing, cheese, where you're supporting an action which is entirely natural, is completely different from trying to force people up a staircase.
I think one of the problems, certainly in our country and maybe in some others, is the unwillingness of people to put resource into the development of teachers over a period of time. So when people talk about the amazing teachers in Shanghai, they're talking about teachers who had 5 years of training, and teachers who are not seen as expert teachers until they've been teaching for 3 to 5 years in a very supported environment. And you're comparing that to, in this country, teachers who've come into teaching in very quick routes and where there hasn't been enough time to work on their own mathematical confidence. And we see the contrast, particularly in primary, where some teachers have come in with just a few days of maths in their entire training, and teachers who've then done a course called Master Course was absolutely brilliant. They've gone off and they've done a course which is particularly about mathematics, and they've done it once they're in post as teachers, so they understand something about children's responses and children's thinking. They understand that, and they're bringing that into the course which they're doing, which focuses on the mathematics. And the quality of some of the teaching of people who've done the Master Course is absolutely amazing. I'm thinking also of the project in Calgary called Math Minds, where they've been working with the same teachers in the same school for 6 or 7 years. And that development, they understand that this development takes time. It's not about saying change your teaching tomorrow and I'm going to come and check what you're doing. It's got to be, everything has got to be a two-way process of human development.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Perhaps this is the time to ask the next question. How has your personal experience informed your work in mathematics education and mathematics curriculum? And again, perhaps I should have began with this question to because you ended up in math education, thanks to your own experiences. So can you tell us about some of these experiences?
Last time we were asked this in a joint interview, it took us 40 minutes. So won't do that. I'll just say we do mathematics, we talk about mathematics, we think about mathematics. Mm-hmm. We're embedded in mathematics. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot to teachers and we help teachers talk a lot to us. We spend a lot of time with I do a lot of time with teachers.
Talking about math.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, when I'm cycling or walking down the street, if I don't have at least one mathematical problem that is sort of available for me, then I feel remiss and remorse and vacant. Everything that I've done in mathematics education, everything I've tried to articulate has been based on my own experience of thinking mathematically, discovering that I was thinking mathematically. I mean, I didn't know that for a long time, or that it was worth talking about. And then I came across Pauline's writing, and lots of other situations have helped. So I advocate other people to work on mathematics themselves in order to have a taste of what it's like for the students to not be fully grasping what is going on at any given moment, because that's what it's like when you're thinking mathematically.
I love the use of the expression thinking mathematically, and having, when you cycle and when you walk, which is something everybody does, right? We go, run errands, and noticing that we do math, noticing that we think mathematically. How do you define mathematics? What would be?
It's a different.
That's a different question. My memory says that mathematics comes from the Greek mathesis, which is basically to do with understanding. Now, understanding is a word that I try not to use. I use comprehending and appreciating instead of the word understanding, because the word understanding is very complicated. But my vague memory is that scientia is the Latin root for science, and that means to know. And mathesis is the Greek, and I believe it has to do with reaching an understanding. So, for example, the word theorem comes from theory, which is, and the Greek root of that is seeing. And a proof of a theorem is basically, can I get you to see what I'm seeing? So, yeah, that's my response.
So if I want to have a takeaway, or our listeners to have a takeaway, to understand what mathematics is, or perhaps to encourage their students, whatever grade level they are, let's develop this mathematical thinking. Let's understand what mathematics is so that we can take on this voice, this authorial voice in math, and develop this, identity as a doer or user of mathematics. What would be, as a teacher, or as someone who wants to see some change in math education, what would be some qualifiers of math so that a learner that does it knows, oh, I'm doing math?
Oh dear, I think it's about I'm being mathematical. We have a problem with takeaways. We prefer to think about eating in. So what happens to you in this conversation? Maybe it's the conversation. So maybe the conversation with teachers is to ask them, what do you think of the things that you do is being mathematical, and to build on that and to work on that. That's what I would say about that. I really don't want to define mathematical thinking, because as soon as you define something, it becomes, okay, today we're going to do this and this and this and this and this. And that's not the fluency of mathematical thinking. It's about seeing the world in an inquiring kind of way that involves spatial and quantifiable things, and also the logic behind things. Yeah, so somebody on Twitter recently said, what's the difference between mathematical thinking and ordinary thinking, or mathematical problem solving and ordinary problem solving? And of course, there's a huge overlap, because we're talking about people's natural powers. So the natural powers that they bring to problem solving in any sphere are brought to mathematics as well. But there are extra things. And one of the things I tried to say in this particular Twitter thread was, look, in mathematics, the things that you're talking about are abstract, and they're brought into the material or manipulable or symbolic worlds. And you manipulate them within those material or symbolic worlds. And that's the doing. But the ideas that you're doing the doing to are always abstract. So there's this simultaneous conversation between the abstract meaning and the manipulable things that you have. Now, that's what is special about mathematics. And so you're doing mathematics when you look at the one thing I was thinking about with John on his bike, we had these massive cranes near us, and they were swinging around and dumping their loads and all kinds of things, and we were looking at the movement, and you could say mathematically that's loci. Let's think about loci, but actually it was beautiful as well. But the beautifulness, what made it beautiful was the fact they didn't bump into each other. And what meant they didn't bump into each other was the mathematics of what they were doing, or we could use the mathematics to describe it. I don't think the crane drivers were thinking, I'm doing mathematics here. They were doing crane driving. But in order to understand that, we did the mathematics, and the mathematics that we did were these abstract ideas that were brought into the material world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, based on what Anne has been saying, I think what I would want to say is, don't worry about classifying mathematical or not mathematical. The danger, as she said, of making a definition is you say, oh, there's this word heuristics. Now, Pauline talked about heuristics. Oh, and I've got a list of 99 heuristics here. 99 heuristics are completely useless because as you look down the list, you either recognize it or you don't. And the most important thing is that the heuristic arises inside you because of the situation, not because you're looking at a page of heuristics. So my proposal would be try to pay attention to the way that you're using yourself in anything and everything that you're doing. And if that turns into looking at, for example, powers, your power to specialize, to generalize, to imagine, to convince, et cetera, by being aware of your own use of your powers, of how your attention works, that offers you insight into what you can do with other people.
Without creating pressure, and I'm sorry, I apologize if it comes across as putting pressure on you, but teachers find it easy, not easy, I should say, but useful when they are given some constructs to work with, some tangibles in terms of this is what math or mathematical thinking, and and so again, just for the sake of teachers saying, okay, kids, when you try to find patterns in things you see around. So the crane story made me think about, oh, I can find patterns here. So perhaps that can be something that we can encourage students to see without pinpointing it. It's basically kind of constraints, but they are constraints that allow us, enabling constraints. Speaking of Davis' work, so patterns would be encourage students to look around and try and identify math problem in things they observe and think about patterns. So the crane can be one example. Measurement, estimation, making sense of symbols, and talked about symbols. And symbols don't necessarily have to be those that math uses. You can make your own. That's the beauty of the natural powers, John, you were talking about. Spatial, as Anne said before, reasoning and making sense of your space. Just with very young kids, just by going in a straight line to take an object from a shelf, that's mathematizing, right? And logic, Anne talked about logic and making sense of experience through quantitative relationship. So perhaps, again, I completely agree with you. We don't want to pinpoint, because when we pinpoint, we push aside other options or possibilities. But with regards to enabling constraints, thinking about really allowing the possibilities to come up.
We very much like the paper by Al Cuoco and Paul Goldenberg and Jean-Marc's Habits of Mind, which is describing the sorts of things that mathematicians think about and the sort of things that mathematicians bother about. One of which is pattern sniffers, is one of the ways that's described. But we did something, we created two books. In 1998, we wrote a book called Questions and Prompts for Mathematical Thinking, because our commitment is about what is the interaction in the classroom going to be like. And that book is still a bestseller for the Association of Teachers of Mathematics. And it's been widely welcomed. And when we introduced the ideas in this book to groups of teachers, the response was, oh, yes, oh, yes, oh, yes. And over the years, we've seen massive changes in the sort of questioning that teachers do in order to keep the mathematics going and to keep that. It's much more than just pattern spotting. It's lots more than that. And to keep that sort of going in their classrooms. And the idea is that the teacher's repertoire of the contribution they can make to the interaction in the classroom broadens by this. And then a friend of ours sort of simplified the book, and we turned it into another book called Thinkers. And just a small subset of the kinds of questions that can be posed that actually encourage creativity and connections, and the students making their own examples of things. Those two books, I think, offer teachers the tactics that they can use in the classroom, so they're not floundering. They're not thinking, well, you know, I asked them to add these two numbers, they've added the two numbers, then what? You know, there are so many things that you can then do, and it's about building repertoire, not expecting teachers to suddenly change, but building a repertoire of interactive techniques that they can use within their current teaching, whatever their current teaching is like.
Mm-hmm.
If you want an abstract and succinct version of all of that, for me, it's discerning details, recognizing relationships between those details, and perceiving properties as being instantiated in those relationships. And all of that is fed from gazing, from holding a whole and simply allowing yourself to be with and present to a situation.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I think that is rethinking what mathematics is and what it can be in terms of classroom discourse and interaction.
It also applies to history, English, geography, Russian, you know, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
It's just that math is, as Anne said before, we lose so many people. You know, by the time they get to grade 6 or even earlier, and we have work that substantiates it, we lose so many people, and that's what dramatizes it. That's what makes it so a pressing issue, rather than, you know, the same ideas that can be and should be implemented in other school subjects.
It's a very good example of children generalizing. If they have a couple of bad experiences and they generalize that to mathematics is not for me, the portcullis comes down, and it's then really difficult to get the portcullis to rise up a bit and sneak underneath it.
Looking at the time and feeling that we've probably told you our main messages and our main drivers
4 times, 8 times.
I think we can count on your fingers.
Oh, yeah.
I think that you know, unless you've got any really sort of burning questions, I feel as if we've probably said enough, and anybody watching this and listening to it,
bored out of their brain,
if they haven't got something by now from this process of eating in or taking away.
Well, just one last question, if you
okay.
So in the face of the crisis of COVID-19, with the school closures, what do you think might be some new directions for research on math, and perhaps policymakers kind of, you know, this is a change that needs to happen because of the experience with the school closures? I know it's a general question, but just last.
My hope or my wish would be that people wake up to the notion that human beings are human beings, they're organisms, they thrive in certain environments, they don't thrive in other environments, and trying to tell them what to do and how to do it has got a bad track record. And
turning the school curriculum into a race,
yes,
where certain children are left behind and certain children are far ahead, is just ridiculous. I think.
Well, can I add that certain policymakers are looking for shortcuts?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. one of the things that's been announced here just yesterday is that they're going to increase the expected standard by the end of what you would call grade 5, it's our year 6, increase the expected standard. So they're going to teach harder and teach faster. And I mean, that's just ludicrous. I think one of the really interesting things is that teachers that I hear are beginning to question what really is of value when you're at an in-person classroom with a teacher and the children in front of you. What is of value that you can do in that environment that you can't do online? And what are the things that you can do online where it's not necessary to have an adult interacting with you? What is the difference between those things? And I think that's quite an interesting question.
It reminds me of the question that we asked at the Open University, because we had a mass, big scale, people reading, learning at home with limited contact with tutors. And it's basically flipped classrooms, but not by that name. And we had a lot of work to do to address that. It seems to me very similar, some considerable similarities and parallels.
I hope
raising questions about what does learning, who does the learning,
exactly,
and how is learning supported and stimulated, promoted.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. It's been an hour. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope we will continue the conversation in another format.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much
up.
for asking the questions.
Yeah, thank you.